Hello and welcome to our Zoobean Expert on Air series. Today I am very excited to welcome Françoise Mouly. Welcome.
Oh, Jordan, I'm so glad to be here with you.
This was totally a dream for me to get to interview you. I've long been a fan of Toon Books, which Françoise founded several years ago. And if you have not seen or checked out Toon Books, please go to your bookstore, go to your library, and see them. We're going to talk a lot about those today. Françoise is also the art editor for New Yorker Magazine and has a probably you can't see them in this picture. I'm sure I know has a shelves full of awards and is really legendary in her field as a creative and as an artist. So also founded Raw, the sort of anthology Raw, which is just she really is a legend. So if you haven't looked her up, go do it. We don't want to spend too long in the introductions, and here really want to focus on her latest venture and sort of passion around Toon Books, which are generally comics and sort of what some people refer to as graphic novels, but we'll get into that that discussion, which I know you have opinions on. And I really would love to start with, we have so many parents in our community at Zoobean who are raising little people right now, and I wonder, tell us about your own childhood. Like, how did you get so passionate about comics and art, and how did this really become something that you've built a life and career around?
I grew up in Paris and in a whole other era because I'm nearly 60 years old. And at the time, I think I benefited from a certain kind of neglect. My parents were far from being helicopter parents. But what I remember vividly is doing art in school, and also that if you worked really, really, really hard, at the end of the year, you won what they called un beau livre, a beautiful book, which was a hardcover book with pictures. So I worked all year long to get that grand prize, and I loved that book, and I read the stories, and I looked at the pictures, and it felt like it was the first time I had something that was mine, that was really for me.
Wow. So also, I guess I'll spare you the questions about the book Bringing Up Bebe. We can at the end, and I'm sure you have.
Thank you.
And I'm like, well, maybe we should go there, but so you sort of you drew this passion. And how about your parents? Did they sort of inspire you with their own creativity? Were they themselves? Was there something in the sauce that made you sort of molded you at an early age, do you think?
Well, it's ironic. It's almost tragic because I think my dad inspired me by negative effect. Like he was a doctor, he was a surgeon, and he really loved me, and he wanted me to take over the family practice and be a surgeon like him. And I rebelled and then studied architecture, went to the Beaux-Arts, and I think a lot of what I did was to find my own voice. But what's ironic is now I have two kids, and they're both wonderful and very creative, and my daughter has worked with me, and my son has been a consultant on my book. So now I see why my dad was so eager to keep a connection with me and with his children, and I have what he was trying to accomplish, but simply because they have chosen to they're interested in everything that we do. So.
And let's talk a little bit about your kids. It sounds like you really. I hear that you recognize this need as a parent. Obviously, you didn't create Toon Books when they were the age to enjoy them necessarily, but you saw that as a parent. So can you tell us a little bit about sort of raising them and how you noticed what was missing from their lives, and how that sort of inspired what has now happened not too long ago. I guess when did Toon Books start in 2008? Is that right? When you found it?
Yeah. So we're in our 6th year, and in part it had to do with like I've been lucky all my life to be able to follow what I'm in love with. So when I was a mom of young children, I was very tuned in, and it was really hard not when I was reading a book with my son or with my daughter. To actually be patient enough to let them get into it. But I realized when I was reading comics with both of them, it had all of the pleasure of reading a book with someone, having them on your lap and the physical closeness. But with the comics, the kids were actually in charge. They could actually follow the visual narratives. It's as if they were finally like driving the car as opposed to being in the passenger seat. And I had lots of French comics, and that's what my son would took longer amount of time to, when the teacher said, okay, by April he has to be reading, and both kids had the same input in terms of their father reading in English and their mother reading in French, and for my daughter, it worked as planned, and for my daughter, it just took longer. And they gave us primers and books that they said we should sit down. And fortunately for me, I didn't have to do that because my son kept asking for comics, so we sat with those. And then a few months later, it clicked for him. So it was just a matter of going with what he was into. And it was a visual narratives because he could decode them himself, even if he didn't have the words.
Interesting. And have you seen, and so you did that with comics that you had, and what was it that, tell us a little bit about how you were inspired to create Toon. So I think, and because I think a lot of those things that you're describing, we see with comics, so they're especially appealing, like you said, to these, I hate to call them like a reluctant reader, but just somebody who takes a little bit longer, right? They're a different way of reaching kids, but at the same time, certainly in our house, but you hear stories everywhere about kids who also just, they love reading them. They're so appealing, and there's so many benefits around sort of like left to right reading and seeing, that experience. Like graphic novels had sort of started to take off that term, I think, in the last several years, but I wonder what it was that made you say, hey, there's a gap here, and I want to create Toon Books, which is in some ways, not as defined as a category, and so I wonder what sort of brought that on for you.
Well, it was exactly that, because all my life I had been fighting for comics to be taken seriously, and actually one of the slogans when I was doing Raw magazine with my husband, who was a cartoonist, was comics are not for kids anymore. And we were trying to fight against the prejudice of like comics were dumbing things down. In fact, actually, when I decided to do comics for kids, it's because there weren't enough good English language comics. We did, Art and I, my husband did a book called Mouse about his parents' experience, and at the time there was enormous opposition about doing any kind of narrative as a comic strip. People thought it was irreverent and could only be a diminishment. Now it has gotten so much praise that it is more accepted, but what wasn't there was good English language comics for kids. So we did a Toon treasury of classic kids comics, hoping to bring that back, and it's in many libraries actually. And we wanted, so there were lots of artists like Jeffrey Hayes, who were doing with Don Benny and Penny for the Toon books, who were eager to do not just illustrated books, because there's a difference between illustrated books where there's a text and the picture, and they are redundant, they actually repeat each other, and a comic where the visual flow is through the pictures, so you see the character moving. And it was explained to me by, first I knew what I wanted to do, and then I found all the teachers and educators who explained to me why it worked. I knew it instinctively from just having spent time with my kids and seeing them read comics on their own. Pick up a book. They pick up visual books, but especially comics. And my husband says that he learned to read because he wanted to figure out whether Batman was a good guy or a bad guy. And in some ways, you know, I met him because I was trying to read in English, and the New York Times was just much too hard. And I asked around, and I found comics. And I think they're a good introduction to language. But when I was talking to a psychologist, Dr. Swirsky, she explained that young children perceive the world in a way that she calls multimodal, meaning that it's not just the words, but it's also what things feel like to the touch and what it smells like and how hot or cold it is. And if I say, il est 4 heures, c'est l'heure du goûter, venez tous, all of the kids, young kids, will come and rush into the room because they'll follow the example of my son or my daughter, and because they somehow smell the cookies and they know that it's snack time. And if I say, like, you know, allez vous laver les mains, they'll go wash their hands because it, you know, they get so much from context. And when we tell them to, at the point where we tell them, like, okay, now you have to get stories from books, if we just give them written stories with illustration, we're narrowing all of those dimensions to just a verbal dimension. In comics, we're giving them a 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 dimensional version of the story, where you have the facial expression, you have the body gesture, you have the soundtrack, you have the big bing bang pow, or, you know, if the character is crying, you will hear the sound of it. You have the spatial relation of the characters. I was just talking to an artist today who was doing a cover for the New Yorker, and all of his narrative is about you know, the body gestures of the characters. You can tell a lot with the non-verbal signifiers, to use a big word. But kids perceive the world that way, especially young kids at that age. And to have a written book or a printed book that actually gives them this rich environment is what lets them go into it out of their own interest, as opposed to like some kind of homework assignment.
Which is also right, like that interest is so important, because that's what's that is going to drive learn. Like you said, with your husband wanting to, you'll learn to read if you want to know what, you know, who Batman is, right? You'll go to extreme measures. You'll figure out words that you don't know. You'll just keep going, right? I think it inspires that perseverance.
Exactly. I mean, you are a parent, so you know. I mean, the one common denominator to all the things that kids learn, and they're learning stuff every single day, is their drive and their interest. They have to be motivated. Like, they're not going to learn French because you think that it's a good idea for them. But if you put them in a school where every kid is learning French, you know, so again, my husband talks about arriving here from Sweden, where his parents had been refugee, and not really speaking English, going out to the courtyard, and then coming back with a black eye and speaking English. And that's, you know, it's basically kids do function in terms of what's useful to them. So if there's a story that they want to find out, if they're curious, but they have to be implicated in it. It's not just some abstract goals that mom or dad have said, this is good for you.
Yeah, and I think when to listen to you speak about this, and especially with all the data sort of like pushed, you know, behind you now, like you said, which I think there's a whole separate hangout on air we can have about like making your life's passion your work. So we'll save that for another day. But you said, you know, now you have all the data and the research sort of driving behind you. And if you haven't seen it, there's a one. I know you've seen it, but people watching, there's a wonderful New York Times article that you did very recently, all about tune, and at the end you have several great quotes in there. One that you referenced just recent, you know, you're speaking to now about that comics being diagrams for extracting meaning from print. But the other piece that you said that I thought was really interesting, and the article sort of ended with, and I'll read it, is I think we need to move past that euphemism of graphic novel. So, it's a 32-page book with 300 words. I don't need to pretend it's a novel. It's a book. It's a comic book. And I wonder, to hear you speak about comics, and to know this, it sounds like a panacea, right? That everything that every issue that you might have with readers, that here they are, they're addressed, and here, you know, just pick up a comic book. But that's not the case. That's not. There's been a lot. There has been some resistance in classrooms, and people are having to sort of be like re-educated. Here, especially, I don't actually know if that's true in places like, if that is true in France, right? But I wonder, you know, if you could expand on those thoughts about, you know, why it is you think we've had to give comics the name of graphic novel, and why it is that there is like some, you know, resistance to comics still, despite all these clear benefits.
You know, it's really important that parents be implicated, because in many ways what we have fought for is teachers being on the defensive, and what they're afraid of is that if they're going to use comics in the classroom, even if they know that works, that some parent are going to walk in and say, "What, you're giving comics to my children? That's terrible," you know, like, I send them to school to learn to read, not to like be their nose in a comic book. Because most people know instinctively that kids will like comics. They don't doubt that. They just doubt the quality of the involvement of the child with the comic. And that's where parents are essential. For one thing, like, you know, as you know all too well, your husband being a teacher, you cannot teach if the parents are not supporting what you do. Like, you really need to have some kind of environment at home. Answers a question, encourage them to talk about what happened during their day, are in a dialogue. And with the teachers, somehow are behind what the teachers are doing. So if a kid gets interested in a comic, often what happens is that they will want to do their own comics. So we do a lot of supporting material for the parents, for the teacher, in a way to give to the kids, but also to explain to the principal and to like give to the parents. Like, most parents don't necessarily know how to read a comic, because you need to, with all of this staging, you know, and context and sound effect, in a way it's almost like a little script for a theater play. You have to make the voices. You can't read a comic in a monotone. You also have to show the kid what words you are reading, and you have to not cover up the words if you're putting your fingers there. Little things like this. You have to spend time on silent panels. So you know, there's instances where the parents are skipping because they're only reading the words, but actually in comics, a lot of the action is told in pantomime. Silent panels are very important. So in the back of our books, we give like a few tips to the parents on how to read comics with kids. And the main thing is that we also encourage parents to read comics themselves and to read the books with the kids, because that's where kids will really respond. If the parents get engaged with the story, like the characters, and the kids are bound to like find their own point of entry.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. So teachers are actually more able to see the value, I guess, is what you're saying, more quickly, but the teachers have more fear might not be the right word, but they're more trepidation, because they are concerned that they have experience that a parent will see their child reading a comic book and say, "Oh, this is like you said, I send my child to school to learn, not to have fun," I guess. Which is probably the wrong perspective anyway.
You put your finger on it. I send my kid to school not to have fun is a big problem. You know, it's a big problem, because actually, you know, what I remember from school, what really was helpful to me is also part, you know, in art class or whatever, also part where I actually had fun. It's exactly when you learn. It's the only time you learn. Yeah. And if you get like fascinated by a topic, like kids that get to like, you know, dinosaurs or Abraham Lincoln or whatever the topic is, will on their own be driven by their curiosity. So I think the parents have to tune in. Like one librarian, Michelle Gorman, was talking about the fact that when she was a kid, she had a twin brother, And at some points they were called in, the mom was called in by the teacher who said like, oh, about your daughter, she's doing great, she's reading all those babysitter clubs and whatever, but your son is actually reading comics. That's no good. So he has to be just like Michelle and read the same kind of books. Now they pulled away the comic book from the poor boy because it wasn't the correct kind of reading, but he was just as passionate a reader. Turns out she became a librarian. You know, she was able to continue with her interest, and he hasn't read a book since. You know, he's a businessman, but he just lost his appeal. Now there's a lot of parents that are afraid of popular culture, whether it be video games, whether it be comics. What you have to understand is that the kids' intelligence invests in what they're interested in, and if it's a good support, and you know that's why we're doing good books. It's not like all comics are great. There's some that are actually, you know, factory made and not of terrific interest, like movies, like TV shows, like everything else. It's a magic bullet as long as you choose your material well. But if you let the kid find out what he's interested in and let her, you know, drive the dialogue, if it's in the dialogue, and you know, have some kind of back and forth also with what the kid is doing in school. And when it's not all teachers that are actually into comics, it's a big change from what it was, but it hasn't totally taken over. There's a lot of work that we still need to do, and that's why we're so delighted when there are parents, you know, that are there, because they can also have an enormous influence on the teacher actually running a classroom as opposed to just trying to get the kids to pass tests.
Yeah, and tell me a little bit about sort of, since the focus is on, you know, interest, which of course is one piece, is just the genre by itself. Like you said, kids just tend to be drawn in many cases to comics first, right, for a lot of reasons. But you have I'm assuming, huge Rolodex of potential artists and writers, and how do you choose some of the books and people to write them and create them, and sort of that mix that you have. You just have a beautiful book that I love. I've written about it a little bit. The revisited Hansel and Gretel by Neil Gaiman, but it's just gorgeous. But for an older set of kids, certainly. How do you sort of create that mix of, you know, artists and authors, and what goes into that process, and, you know, creating the portfolio, which is you know, very selective, I think.
Yes, the Hansel and Gretel book is a good example of what I mean in terms of being interested in visual narrative and in visual storytelling. We say tune books for visual readers, because at first, as the editor of the New Yorker, I was asking artists to do visual interpretation of Hansel and Gretel for an opera that the Met was putting on for the Hansel and Gretel opera. And one of the artists was Lorenzo Matodi, and did those extraordinary black and white drawings of the forest, lost in the forest. Extremely evocative. And I really wanted to publish this as a book here, and I was concerned that people would say, oh, it's too scary for children. And there is, you know, it's an art book, it's fine, it would have found a limited audience, but that they wouldn't think that it could be read by, here we're talking about 8, 10, 12 years old, or adults, actually. And that's when I asked Neil Gaiman, who actually happens to be a friend, whether he would be interested. And he said, oh my God, this is the thing I remember from being 4 or 5 years old. This is the one story that scared me to death. That's when I realized that actually we could be eaten, that we're made of meat. It was a very profoundly scary and haunting story for him, and he was eager to actually took the time to reimagine, and because the pictures were so stark and so raw, he actually did the same thing in his story. He didn't Disneyfy it. He didn't try to hide the primal themes of it, makes for a very strong book. And what's interesting to me, and thanks to Neil Gaiman, I have the okay. Thanks to Neil Gaiman, it's now finding an audience, where it may not have if it had been just a matter of publishing just the pictures and an art book. But it's also raising the issue as to whether something that is so intense and so potentially scary is okay for children. Do we have to protect our children? And, the answer there is one of the ways we protect our children and gives them the means to deal with fear. It's not like we're going to be able to raise children that will never be afraid. There will always be something. My son had horrible nightmares, and I couldn't do anything to protect him. But the one thing that you can do is actually sit down and go through something that is scary, or even a book, or I've done this with my kids, with movies frame by frame, and actually talk and have a dialogue. And a book is a great way to master anything. One of the original thrills for the baby is a peekaboo, where they're scared, and then they acquire mastery, and then they find it hilarious and can't get enough of it until you play peekaboo with your baby. But it is an important thing to give the path through which you control your emotion, rather than pretending that those emotions will never happen.
Yeah, I love that example. And it's funny, even listening to you, I'm thinking, I read Hansel and Gretel myself. I read the book when I got it, and I told you I felt, I was very riveted when I was reading it. Obviously you know the ending. It's not like you don't know what's going to happen, but just the way the story is told, you forget it. It does inspire so much fear. But I haven't. I have a 4.5-year-old, and I hadn't read it to him, probably for those reasons. But now I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, and knowing that Neil Gaiman also heard the story of Hansel and Gretel at a young age makes me think, well, that it could turn out for the best then. So, yeah, so I will read it to him tonight. And you're right, the dialogue piece is huge. I mean, that is with anything, right? I mean, kids, they find things out. They learn that things and people die. They learn, when they start to sort of put those pieces together, if they're imagining things in their own mind and not having a conversation about it with somebody, it's certainly much scarier than talking about it.
Well, that's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about books, is because they last and they have a long shelf life. And if you are raising kids, you know how quickly they change. But if you have books around and if you read books with them, you can have the right book when they're ready. They will find it. You don't have to try to figure out a time schedule for them. They'll find their own time schedule. And that's where you'll have anchor points for your conversations. And some of the books that kids read and reread, they go back to it 3 or 4 years later. We just got a letter from a mom who was talking about her daughter discovering a point of entry into books through the Toon books. And the first book she read was Little Mouse, and then she fell in love with Odo's Orange Day. And now she's an avid reader. She's reading a grade or two above her grade. And every once in a while, she'll sneak back to that one book, which was her first book, and she'll reread it for the 3,000th time. So that's a wonderful gift to have for your kids.
It is. And since we're talking about kids, and I recognize we're sort of hitting our toward our end here, I would love to, at the very beginning, you started by telling us that your parents were the opposite of helicopter parents, but very much wanted you to sort of remain in the family business, and you managed to end up with kids who are incredibly creative and who are sort of partners in your work. And so I wonder, what parenting advice do you have for folks, certainly around inspiring creativity? We have, I think, a whole host of wonderful advice now around reading and principles of thinking about comics especially. But what about your own kids, and what were some of the sort of core principles that you and your husband espoused? I guess they were going to come out and be creative no matter what. I mean, with their gene pool, but what were some of the sort of things that you did or didn't do that you think helped them to cultivate their own, successful, happy careers, later in life?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things that I'm aware of in terms of the privilege that we have and the privilege that our kids have. One is the fact that a career as an artist is a possibility, that you could actually do this. And I was talking to a friend of ours who is a musician, and his wife, the mom of the kid, is actually in the theater, and he was saying that the kids are growing up, his two kids, boy and girl, are growing up thinking that they will be not just musicians or actors or playwrights, but they will be successful, and they'll be able to make a living at it. And that's actually a great option for kids, to think that it's possible to do something that you love, and not just as a hobby, but it's also simply the pleasure of making things and having them be seen and landed. Like, I think part of it was I never made my kids play or paint or sculpt or whatever, but they always had art materials around, in part because we had drawing tables and paint and clay. And it is hard, as you know. I mean, as a parent, it's hard to not tell your kid how to do this or to direct what they are doing and to be accepting, but you can discover so much. Especially, I think, if you're an artist yourself, you realize when you're watching kids drawing how creative it is. They come up with new ideas all the time. There is an age where they become self-conscious about their drawing, and that's a point where almost all kids draw. It's rare that a kid that doesn't try to make scribbles, and all kids know how to read drawings. Like, there's no kid that has needed to be taught how to find Waldos. So they have a kind of like inner ability to lose themselves in pictures and to make pictures and to sculpt. And it's when they become self-conscious, oh, that's not good enough. And when they're trying to do things that where their skill set is not there, where they can be encouraged to keep going, even in their writing. And there, you also have to be in a dialogue and make sure that the teachers are also encouraging, and they don't get too discouraged by. I mean, it depends on the school, but often we were lucky to have teachers in the schools that both our kids went to who actually gave them assignment and didn't want the parents to do the assignment for them, so they were very self-motivated, which is great, which is, I think, really helpful for anyone in creative fields and not.
Yeah, well, that's excellent advice, and I think, I feel very lucky. We have I have a brother-in-law who's a musician and an artist, and a video installation artist, and I always thank goodness that he's part of our family, because now my kids, like you said, have somebody who's very close to them who they can look to and say, this person is an artist, this is his career, and sort of view and really know that that's a possibility, like you said. But honestly, it is possible to show that, and just have, if you're visiting a museum, or if you're looking at artwork, or if you're looking at reading a tuned book, right? If you're reading the Big White Balloon, right? You can say, this is somebody created this book, or any book that you're reading, right? Somebody made this book, an illustrator, made these beautiful pictures, and this is their career, that's what they do, and sort of making those connections, not just that somebody drew them, but that that's somebody's livelihood, right? And, beyond.
And it's more and more true, I think there is no distinction between what you do and what I do. I mean, you run a business out of your home, I run a business out of my home. It's not, I think in that sense, like, the kids are exposed to their parents' work life. When my children were young, there was take your daughter to work day. But in this day and age, I think one of the things that parents have that they can explore is the kids are with them at work every day because they work at home. You know, even if you go to an office, you still bring things back. So there's not that separation of like you come home and then you know, your wife is giving you a martini and then that's a whole other world. As you know well, I'm sure your husband is not serving you a drink when you come home. Like the kids are exposed to their parents' intellectual life, and we know when you go to a museum it's for your pleasure. So I think that's all you need is to have the fluid, do things that you're interested in, and your kids will be encouraged in things they are interested in. And we do include a lot of things. Activity sheets. I think one of the great things about comics and the books that we do is that it almost inevitably shows you the hand of the artist who has done it. So it's a very direct thing, and it makes kids want to do their own. And we just got a whole batch of drawings by kids from a school about, you know, the Toon books. They've read the books and they have given us their drawings.
Those were fabulous.
Sent us notes, asked us questions, and that's a marvelous, like, back and forth, getting a sense of somebody who made this. And it's hard in this day and age with video games, and you don't get a sense, or animated cartoons or CGI, you don't get a sense that you could make your own. But with books and with comics, the handmade part is so real for the child. You can, you know, encourage your kid to do just that. A sheet of paper folded in two, that's a little book in and of itself.
Yeah, I love that, and I think that's a great way to wrap up, and I appreciate it so much. If you have not seen Toon books, please go and find yourself one at your library bookstore. They are really wonderful, and they've been absolutely incredible for our family, both of our kids, ages 2.5 and 4.5. Love them, love reading them, and I enjoy reading them with them. So it's a win for all of us. And thank you again, Françoise, for joining us. This has been a great conversation.
Well, thank you, Claude, and it's really, I'm so admirative of what you're doing. I wish you and all the parents who are with the kids all the best.
Thank you so much.